So I think we can get started and let people, if any latecomers should want to join, we'll let them in. I'm delighted to introduce what is the first conversation among many in a series called Biographies of Interwar Isms. The idea of the concept is quite simple. It's to use the biography or biographies as a prism to explore the many isms of the interwar period, bridging it with its 19th century roots and its 20th century and 21st century legacies. The series has been organized by the Global Biography Working Group, GloBio, the Center for Modern European Studies at the University of Copenhagen, and the New Diplomatic History Network, and last but not least, the International History Department of the LSE. We're recording, and I've already put up a link for the New Diplomatic History podcast, which is where this will be posted once it's all edited and done. So I won't say much else except I am really looking forward to this, and hand the word over and the introductory remarks to Victoria Phillips. Please, the word is yours, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Håkon, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for your interest. I want to thank all the organizers and co-sponsors, and Tom Ellis is here from the London School of Economics, who is head of the Americas cluster. I'm representing the Cold War cluster, so we thank everybody for their interest. I'm here to introduce our two speakers and moderate. As you all know, this is being recorded, and it will go up on the Global Biography Working Group webpage, and it will be made into a podcast as well. So please feel free to share the links with friends, families, and colleagues once it's done. What we'll do is we're a relatively small group, I'll take questions if you want to unmute yourself, or feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and I can begin to moderate them after we hear from our speakers. Professor Zipp and Cook will speak each for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion and Q&A, and the entire program will last about an hour and 15 minutes. We look forward to a grand discussion, and a very timely one. In the order in which they'll speak, I'll introduce the two of them. Blanche Wiesen-Cook is Distinguished Professor of History and Women's Studies at the John Jay College and the Graduate Center of the City of New York. Her definitive biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, Volume 1, The Early Years, Volume 2, The Defining Years, and Volume 3, The War Years and After, were published by Viking. And the trilogy was called Monumental and Inspirational, a Grand Biography by the New York Times Book Review. Volume 1 was on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 months, received many awards, including the 1992 Biography Prize from the Los Angeles Times. Eleanor Roosevelt Volume 2 was also on the New York Times bestseller list. And Volume 3 was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2016 and was one of NPR's 10 Best Books of 2016. The author of numerous articles, Professor Cook's books include The Declassified Eisenhower, which is one of my favorite books, which must come back into print, and her books, and a New York Times Book Review Notable Book of 1981, and Crystal Eastman on Women in Revolution with Oxford University Press. For more than 20 years, she produced and hosted her own program, originally called Activists and Agitators, and Women and the World in the 1980s. Professor Cook has appeared frequently on television on such programs as The Today Show, Good Morning America, C-SPAN Book Notes, and McNeil-Lehrer, where she participated in the joint PBS-NBC coverage of the 1992 Democratic National Convention. She's served as vice president for research of the American Historical Association and vice president and chair of the Fund for Open Information and Accountability. She was co-founder and co-chair of the Freedom of Information and Access Committee of the Organization of American Historians, which was actively committed to maintaining the integrity of the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. And I'd like to add that Professor Cook has been a wonderful mentor to me and to numerous others, and we thank her for her consistent generosity and activism. Samuel Zipp is, or Sandy Zipp, is Associate Professor of American Studies and Urban Studies at Brown University. He received his PhD in American Studies from Yale University. He serves as vice president of the board of Down City Design, a community-based design studio in Providence, Rhode Island. His most recent book is The Idealist, Wendy Wilkie's Wartime Quest to Build One World, Belknap Press. And he's also written Manhattan Projects, The Rise and Fall of Urban Renewal in Cold War New York, Oxford University Press. He co-edited Vital Little Plans, the short works of Jane Jacobs, Random House with Nate Storing. And over the years, he's written reviews and essays for magazines, journals, and newspapers, including the New York Times, Washington Post, The Nation, Public Books, The Baffler, Metropolis, Cabinet, In These Times, and, as he says a long time ago, Hotwired. And with that, I'll hand the microphone and the chair to Professor Cook.
Wow, thank you so much, Victoria, and you are my mentor. And I am very grateful to you. Your global vision is so important. And now Sandy Zipp is our mentor. This book is so important. We need Wendell Willkie now, perhaps more than ever. When I read your book, I was just inspired to think of all the times that Eleanor Roosevelt contemplated one world and peace, which she did really from the 1920s on, and or before that. She actually becomes a member of Jane Addams' group, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is founded in 1915, and Jane Addams and Lillian Wald and Carrie Chapman Catt are among her many mentors. When I was going through volumes 1, 2, and 3, looking for the ways in which Eleanor Roosevelt confronted war and the danger of war and, pursued the goal of peace, which has really been around. I mean, the idea that we have to have peace and human rights, and that we won't have peace until we have human rights and dignity for all, is bouncing around the world really for a very long time. And in 1920 or so, she gets involved with the movement to support the Kellogg-Briand Treaty. There's actually a treaty to outlaw war, and she invites 400 women to Hyde Park to launch the women's peace movement with Carrie Chapman Catt. And Carrie Chapman Catt becomes the convener of the National Conference on the Cause and Cure of War. And there she says, what we really have to have is a crusade against war, as mighty as the anti-slavery crusade. And that's the 1920s. She writes articles. She edits at this time something called the Women's Democratic News. And she writes articles about how women are organizing all over Europe And in England, there are demonstrations. In London, there's a peace convergence of English and European women who seem to feel more deeply than we do. And of course, she understands that that is because they have seen the horrors of war in their own communities. And she calls for a movement. And this becomes, she says, long before the war clouds gathered, her message was urgent. The time to prepare for world peace is during the time of peace and not during the time of war. So let me, there are so many, she becomes fervent about ending colonialism, and she becomes part of the Free India movement. She campaigns for the World Court and for the US to join the League of Nations, and which the United States does not actually join. And she writes an article, why wars must cease, why wars are obsolete. And I'd like to read: the world conflagration of 1914 to 18 proved for the first time in our history that the war idea is obsolete. It achieved none of its objectives, which we were told in the US was to preserve democracy and to prevent the people of Europe from coming under the control of a despotic government, which had no regard for treaties or the rights of neutral nations. And above all, World War I was to end all future wars. And so in terms of these objectives, these 4 years were absolutely wasted. Then at Versailles, the horror was compounded. Instead of preventing future wars, the Versailles Treaty, these settlements arrived and have simply fostered hostility. There is more talk of war today, not to mention wars actually going on in the Far East and in South America, than has been the case for many long years. The world over, countries are armed camps. This is an article, Why Wars Must Cease, Why War is Obsolete. And then she has an extraordinary paragraph about how we worship the gods of mammon. Private profit is made out of the dead bodies of men. The more we see of the munitions business, of the use of chemicals, of the traffic in armaments, the more we realize that human cupidity is as universal as human heroism. If we are to do away with the war idea, one of the first steps will be to do away with all possibility of private profit. Is that prescient or what? And then she says, what we need is for people to organize all around the world, to persuade their governments to find the way to stop war. And she makes a series of speeches, which were very controversial at the time because the US was, quote, isolationist. And then there were, of course, right-wingers who absolutely despised her and wanted no, part of the World Court, which she was supporting and working for a wonderful woman named Esther Lape. And I just want to say, there is no biography of Esther Lape, L-A-P-E, who was a great a really great hero of the peace movement, and also the movement for a national health care program, which she lobbied for to get into the Social Security Act of 1935. It was supposed to be essentially socialized medicine, 1935, and it didn't. The AMA lobbied it to death, and she fought for that kind of medical reality, free healthcare that exists all over, the industrial world now, until her death in 1982. And there's no biography of this extraordinary woman. The bottom line is Eleanor Roosevelt, I could go on and on, really understood that human rights and peace, the end to war, were united when we have dignity for all, education for all, housing and health and jobs for all. Then we will have peace for all, and we are all in this together, one world. Thank you, Sandy, Zipp, and Victoria, and all of you.
Thank you so much, Blanche. Thanks for everyone for having me. I'm going to jump right in so we can get into more discussion. Thanks to Victoria and Hekon for inviting me to talk with you all. And I'm so glad to be here with Blanche Wiesen-Cook, because as she has really made clear, Wendell Willkie was to some degree a part of this larger tradition of people like Eleanor Roosevelt that Blanche has just outlined here, who imagined a progressive, global, but mutualistic vision of America's place in the world. Unfortunately, I think that connection has been mostly lost. And in part, this is because Willkie was not actually an integral part of the movements that Blanche has just laid out for us, right? He was not, in that sense, a pacifist. He was not part of a larger pacifist and anti-war movement going back into the early part of the 20th century, although he had connections to the campaign for the League of Nations and various kinds of anti-racist campaigns as well, I'll mention in a little bit here. The other reason I think that we lose track of why Wendell Willkie is important in stories like this is because we don't actually know much about Wendell Willkie himself. The story of Wendell Willkie's world travels, his best-selling book, and the idea of one world have been hidden by a more conventional story surrounding Willkie, one you might be familiar with if you're familiar with Willkie at all. So most often when we hear about Willkie today, we're most likely to recall the fact that he was the losing candidate in the 1940 presidential election in the United States. So he's thought of often as one of the most famous also-rans in US history. And the story there is that he helped Franklin Delano Roosevelt to take the US into World War II in a kind of team of rivals kind of sort of model, right? He prepared the way for the fabled and now threatened liberal world order established during and just after World War II. And I think in a way, the story is sort of true, but I also want to suggest it's not his most important legacy, and that thinking of it as the central story surrounding Willkie has obscured his what really should be thought of as his most important legacy, which is the fraught but consequential idea of one world. So I'll sketch out that vision here today, showing how he distilled ideas that Eleanor Roosevelt and others had long advocated for, and how he helped make them part of a sort of brief blazing moment during World War II when it seemed that they might actually be made true. Now, my book, The Idealist, which Victoria mentioned, just a little advertising here, tells the story of Wendell Willkie's journey around the world in 1942 and the rise and fall of that idea of one world as Willkie understood it. It shows how he and that idea represented or symbolized some of the dilemmas of what we today offhandedly call globalization, and presaged some of the dilemmas we are still facing 3/4 of a century ago. So I'm recalling that journey and the idea in the hope that the ideas might be of some use to all of us during our own times of global crisis. Whether or not one subscribes entirely to the idealism of those one world ideas, we can still use it as a goad to our thinking and use it as a goal, as Blanche has so nicely laid out. So the phrase one world comes from a long tradition of internationalist thinking, But it also sort of became concretized as the title of Wilkie's 1943 bestseller. As I said, he wasn't the first to use the term. As we've heard, many internationalists with similar ideas had used it in one way or another. I think H.G. Wells used it very early on. Roosevelt and other thinkers in and around World War I used it. But it was really, in many ways, his vast popularity and visibility for a comparatively very short time, the quasi-celebrity that he enjoyed during World War II, that gave the term the power to signify a kind of whole worldview and brought it suddenly out into a much larger audience than I think it had before. My book reveals the larger cultural history of this celebrity, how Wilkie's political fame arose at the heart of what I call the age of broadcasting, a time of radio networks, the news wires, syndication services, the newsreels, the picture magazines, right? This interwar moment, really, before the media fragmentation that would be unleashed in the wake of the television revolution of the 1950s and 60s. This time where one could assemble this giant audience around singular ideas. Now, in many ways, the one world worldview, we might call it, was quite simple. Wilkie announced it in the opening moments of the book, and I'm going to give you, throughout this little few remarks here, some sense of his language here. As he put it, there are no distant points in the world any longer. The airplane and a global war, he argued, had combined not only to shrink space, but also to push Americans towards a new understanding of their nation's political responsibilities. All the world's peoples were being drawn closer together, he said, while the United States in particular was now inescapably enmeshed with the rest of the world. He declared that, quote, our thinking in the future must be worldwide. Now, these insights were the product not just of his long-held interests in internationalism, but of the product of a journey that Wilkie took around the world in the late summer of 1942 to visit the battlefronts. Now, he was carrying messages to Allied leaders from his former rival, FDR. He flew 31,000 miles in 49 days, making stops in the Middle East, the Soviet Union, and China. Upon his return to New York, 36 million people tuned in to hear his report to the people, which is broadcast over all the radio networks. And One World, the book, which reached about 4 million readers when it was published in 1943, gave that vast audience an account of the trip and was the culminating act in Wilkie's rise to become a kind of popular icon of global idealism. So I tell the full story of the trip in the book, in The Idealist. His stops across Africa, the Middle East, Russia, Asia, in Nigeria, Sudan, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Iran, the Soviet Union, and China, and all the people he met in Cairo, Ankara, Beirut, Jerusalem, Baghdad, Tehran, Moscow, and Chongqing, from Charles de Gaulle to Joseph Stalin to Chiang Kai-shek, and a host of other leaders and ordinary people in between. And the book gives you a sense of what he encountered there, a world of insurgent peoples whose desire for freedom did not make it into the headlines and newsreels carrying war news around the globe. What he really discovered was a planet poised between two great world ordering forces, right? The European empires on the one hand, the British, the French, the Dutch, that had shaped the globe since the 19th century and before, and the new rising power of the United States, which was struggling with itself in these years to figure out how it would greet, understand, and interact with the world it was poised to dominate in the years after the war. In many ways, One World was really written for Americans to try to get them to actually confront the world as it was. And it was really most important thing for Americans to understand that Wilkie wanted to try to get across was that what he called the oneness of the world was a new geopolitical and emotional reality that Americans had yet to really see and to really understand. In a speech in 1943, not long after the book came out, he said, quote, we can stop thinking of the world today as a geographical map, splotches of color that stand only for nations and national possessions. And we can begin to think of the human beings who live within those splotches of color as living also within a larger map that marks a single world. So for him, there was this kind of new universal world space that offered a clear political lesson. The peace, he said, must be planned on a world basis, making real the full global interdependency that he hoped would push Americans to avoid the two threats to future world peace: isolationism on the one hand and empire on the other, both of which were underpinned by what he called, quote, narrow nationalism. Now, however, Wilkie hoped to show Americans not only that single world, right, that universal world, but also a kind of sort of a new, what I think of as a new world geography. The world was not only becoming one, Wilkie argued, It was being reshaped. As he put it, perhaps the most significant fact in the world today, he wrote, is the awakening that is going on in the East. This realization pushed him to challenge Americans to seize the demands of the world's colonized peoples. He was, as he wrote in the closing moments of One World, quote, only passing on an invitation which the peoples of the East have given us. So from the Middle East to China, lands under various degrees of current or historic sway to European powers, Wilkie made himself into a vehicle, a kind of medium, I think of it as, not only for the idea of a unified world, but also for the widespread demand that the freedom for which the Allies fought in the war should be extended unilaterally and without regard for colonialism. As he put it, men and women all over the world are on the march, physically, intellectually, and spiritually. They are no longer willing to be Eastern slaves for Western profits. The big house on the hill surrounded by mud huts has lost its awesome charm. Right? Throughout the world, he said, freedom means the orderly but scheduled abolition of the colonial system. But what I think is also important to remember about Wilkie is that he didn't stop there. He was really issuing, as I've sort of suggested, a challenge to Americans as well. As he put it, the moral atmosphere in which the white race lives is changing. It is changing not only in our attitude toward the people of the Far East, it is changing here at home. The United States, he charged, had long, quote, practiced inside our boundaries something that amounts to race imperialism. Now, Wilkie had been involved in civil rights efforts for several years before his trip. And his beliefs in equality, in fact, dated to his early years and efforts actually to fight the Ku Klux Klan in his native Midwest in the 1920s. His progressive views had earned him the support of many African Americans in the 1940 election to kind of split the African American vote, really, in many ways, between him and FDR, and including the endorsement of major Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier. But it was his trip, I think, that really allowed him to see how American ideals of freedom were at stake and could be found wanting. During a war against fascism and militarism, when colonized peoples were making their freedom dreams known, the United States had to look to its own inequities as well if they were going to understand the world and what was at stake. It is becoming increasingly apparent to thoughtful Americans, he wrote, that we cannot fight the forces and ideas of imperialism abroad and maintain any form of imperialism at home. The war has done this to our thinking. Perhaps Eleanor Roosevelt would have suggested that we should have been thinking this way all along, but Wilkie is amongst many Americans who are suddenly waking up to these issues during the war, and both Roosevelt and Wilkie were carrying this message home. I think Wilkie and Roosevelt were really almost alone, right? Well, maybe we would say that they're at sort of the top of the heap, as mainstream white political figures with the cultural reach to access literally millions of American homes, right? Eleanor Roosevelt in her My Day column and Wilkie in many of his writings, in labeling domestic segregation as akin to colonialism, as a kind of imperialism at home. And it will be interesting to compare notes here with Blanche about how far Eleanor Roosevelt was able to go in this, given how she had to be careful about what she needed to say, given her husband's policies. Wilkie took it as part of his job to try to push FDR on many of these things in public, and he could do that in a way that perhaps in some cases Eleanor Roosevelt couldn't. Anyway, the big challenge of the war, Wilkie argued, was that it showed how the fate of the United States rested on challenges that were both within and beyond the nation's borders. He really wanted to see how these were interpenetrate, right? Really picking up a theme from Eleanor Roosevelt's ideas and those ideas of many of those earlier progressive era figures like Jane Addams and the others who founded organizations like the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, right? To really have Americans imagine that their fate rested with the rest of the world's fate. So it's kind of a sense of reciprocity with the world that he's trying to inculcate. American power and independence in the post-war world, Wilkie argued, would require embracing interdependence with others. Interdependence with the world was in turn dependent on the independence of subject peoples, both at home and abroad. And so the nation's freedom to act in the post-war world required it to work to end colonialism and racism, both at home and abroad. As he put it, the way to make certain that we do recover our traditional American way of life with a rising standard of living for all is to create a world in which all men everywhere can be free. So basically, to sum up, Wilkie's newly interdependent world, his shrinking world, was intended to call into question rather than reaffirm unquestioned assumptions about American or even Western dominance. the lack of capacity for self-governance in the colonized world, a very common mainstream idea amongst white countries in those years, or in relation to that, the hierarchies of race that undergirded those assumptions. The United States, he argued, was enmeshed in a larger world in which its power relied on its efforts to advance the freedom of the peoples of the globe, not just the United States' promise that it abstractly stood for that freedom around the world. Now, at the same time, I should say, and I go into this in much greater detail in my book, Wilkie wasn't entirely free of nationalist impulses. Let me just say for now that he challenged Americans, as I've just said, but he also was not immune to the idea that the US could fix the world. His worldview in some ways depended in many ways on the centrality of the United States. In fact, he thought that one of the things that bound all people together in the new one world was fondness for the United States. One of the most important things binding the world together, he wrote, was, quote, the mixture of respect and hope with which the world looks to this country. So by that measure, the United States sat at the heart of the world's expectations. The opportunity and power lay not with those levying demands for freedom, but with Americans. The implication was that the interdependency sought could be guaranteed only by the presence and power of the US to protect it. This note in his ideas suggested how in later years the idea of one world could be reduced to a vision of American global sway against his, I think, ideas and many of the ideas of others who had promulgated these ideas earlier. But in this version of it, the nation's supposedly benevolent influence over a unified globe occluded the very presence of American empire and power itself. So I hope I've given you a sense of how Wilkie embodied, in some sense, the dilemmas of global interdependence. He popularized the idea of one world, an anti-racist view of the world that hoped to create a more democratic shape for future world order, one that hoped to end empire and give smaller countries a greater role on the world stage. And in the book, you can read about how that vision fared during the founding of the United Nations and the coming of the Cold War. But what I've hoped to share with you today is how Wilkie's vision reflected not only the ambivalent and charged dilemmas of his own moment, but of the globalized times we all live in today. And as I try to show in the conclusion to my book, Wilkie's ideas predicted our own times. Like other internationalists, he suggested the way that some kind of widely shared ethos of global connection that went beyond the formal governance and even cooperation of nation states would be necessary to handle the increasingly global challenges of modern life. But the recalcitrant current of nationalism that also worked its way through his ideas suggested how hard this would be to achieve and how it's still out there for us to achieve today. You know, I think we can all see this, particularly now in this time of a global pandemic, the brutal effects of which have been accelerated here in this country by a sense that the US can and should just somehow go it alone. And the Russian invasion, of course, of Ukraine should only underline this. This is not America's world anymore, if it ever was. And a reinvigorated form of global cooperation is going to be the only way forward in a time of war, in a time of pandemic, and a time of climate change. Thanks, and I'm looking forward to talking more about this.
Thank you both so much for these wonderful openings to what I know is going to be a phenomenal conversation. I know this is one of, if anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will open it up. I will take host's prerogative and go into a bit of what we spoke about last night. Question about, did they meet? I know that was a question. Even if they didn't, you know, where would they disagree and where would they agree? I mean, I think it's the agreement is more obvious, but you know, where would they disagree? And also, I find it fascinating, you know, this kind of the force of FDR centering them and how they circled around FDR, I think is a very interesting question, and how to navigate the political realities that FDR may be represented anyway. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Well, I'm not sure how often they met. I know they did meet. The first time that Wilkie came to the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt was very angry that she was not invited to meet him, and, you know, protested. And one has to wonder why FDR didn't tell her he was coming. But everybody, she said, everybody was abuzz and waiting to see him. And, you know, he had this great power. They absolutely agreed about race. And Eleanor Roosevelt, in her obituary column, after she attended his funeral, wrote about how important his contribution to the ending of our racist reality is going to be, because he really moved the African-American population so much. And so that was, you know, and it was Wilkie who brought up the question of segregation. He wanted to end the poll tax. He wanted to end there was an anti-lynch bill. He wanted to cancel the efforts to get an anti-lynch bill. He wanted, you know, he wanted very specific things, but mostly in terms of this moment, to end the poll tax so that everybody could vote was so important. And Eleanor Roosevelt was in complete agreement with that. And of course, given the nature at the time of the Dixiecrat rule of the Democratic Party, that was way ahead of where FDR would go publicly. So she was very grateful to Wendell Willkie for that. And then they agreed about the need to end imperialism. I mean, empire has to go. All people need to be free. And Eleanor Roosevelt wrote constantly about the need for, you know, the end of colonialism. And Churchill, of course, was very powerful at the time, and Eleanor Roosevelt despised Churchill's racism and his imperialism. And there was really, at one point, visiting London, Churchill actually says to Eleanor Roosevelt, "You don't like me very much, do you?" And she says, "Well, no, I don't. I don't agree with anything you say." You know, so, but she did agree with Wendell Willkie.
I'm not going to try an impression of Wendell Willkie to equal your ER impression, Blanche. It's wonderful. I guess the question that I have about that is how explicitly, particularly along the domestic racial issues, how explicitly was Eleanor Roosevelt able to campaign against, say, a poll tax or for an anti-lynching bill in the way that Willkie was in her columns? Or did she have to veil that in more abstract terms, given the situation you outlined with the Democrats?
Well, in her column, she's very blunt. You know, she does really, well, certainly after FDR dies on the 12th of April, 1945, then, you know, she's very public.
Right.
And, you know, tells students in the 50s and 60s to go south for freedom. But in the 40s, she has many columns about how we must, you know, we must end the poll tax, we must end the barriers, the literacy tests that Black people are doomed to fail. When I taught at Hampton Institute, an historically Black college, a bunch of us went to register to vote, and all of us who taught at Hampton failed the literacy test, even though we were ABD from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, you know. So it went on and on and on, but Eleanor Roosevelt was opposed to it as early as the 40s in print.
Right, I see. Okay, interesting. I think it's one of the fascinating things about the relationship that they must have had, which doesn't really appear from Willkie's side of the kind of archival record as much. I mean, I think that's in part because Willkie is so obsessed with Roosevelt, right? With Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with FDR. He's really finding at every moment a way that he can separate himself from Roosevelt politically, because in some ways they had become so close, right? I mean, part of what I didn't really lay out in too much detail in my talk is that for most of his life, Wilkie is a Democrat, and he only converts to the Republican Party in late 39 or early 1940 in order to actually run another Republican ticket in a complex process you can read about in the book. He's sort of anti-New Deal in various ways, even though he had voted for Roosevelt even in 32. So when he comes to the public eye in the late 30s, he's very concerned to separate himself from Roosevelt anywhere he can, which I think leads him both in some ways, right, to align himself to the left of Roosevelt with civil rights activists like Walter White, and thus to be in accord with someone like Eleanor's policies or interests and beliefs. But then on other things, he has to tack to the right, which I know annoyed Eleanor Roosevelt. And there's this period in the early 1940s where many people think that because Wilkie had been a businessman, right, he wasn't really a career politician, he worked for a utility holding company, that he was in some ways some kind of a stalking horse for big capital, and was really a sort of false flag kind of candidate with big capitalist interests behind him. I don't think that was I know that was not actually was true. He's much more of his own candidate. But that made the politics of it all very sort of not easy to pin down. And so that's why it's part why this period is so interesting, right? Because you have a long-standing tradition, signified here by Eleanor Roosevelt, of activists who are working for peace, right? Who look to try to move the global situation through the League of Nations toward peace. But then with the coming of the war, things really get thrown up in the air. So some of those people will align with people on the right in the America First Committee, right? And hope to keep the United States out of the war. But then there are people like Roosevelt and Wilkie across party lines by that point who know that the United States will have to get into the war. And I don't think Wilkie ever considered himself a pacifist the way perhaps Eleanor Roosevelt did. But he knew he would have been classified as an interventionist then.
Well, an
in some ways the same as
internationalist.
Yes.
Because he supports, I mean, Roosevelt talks about the four freedoms, and there should be a United Nations, and the vision of the United Nations following the war begins, in 44. And both Eleanor, I mean, and that's thrills. That's the reconciliation when FDR says there will be what will become the United Nations, and Wilkie supports that.
Yeah, the interesting thing about his relationship to the United Nations is that he hopes to push Roosevelt to go even further on the United Nations, right? He's not happy about the structure of the Security Council, right? He wants to see a much more democratic body. He wants something like what became the General Assembly to have much more administrative and executive power over the body.
One world.
Right, one world, exactly. And so, I am sure that that Eleanor Roosevelt probably agreed with him to a certain extent on that. The other thing to note for the audience is that Wilkie dies very abruptly in the fall of 1944 after sort of bombing out of the 1944 presidential campaign and failing rather dramatically to become the Republican presidential candidate. So a lot of the story about this ends up as a series of what ifs. What if Wilkie had lived, and then what if Roosevelt had lived? Right? One of the interesting stories you can get from my book as well is the tentative attempts they made to set up a new liberal party, where they thought about joining forces and taking the liberals from the right, from the Republicans and from the Democrats, and joining them in a new party that might try to unite those forces and try to create a new majority in the post-war world. Wilkie died before any of it could be realized, and it was a fraught undertaking anyway, but it was an interesting moment there. So it's a fascinating, what I really think is so interesting about this time, and what I try to capture in my book, and I think what you get from the third volume of Blanche's book on ER too, is just this sense of how much is up in the air in this moment, how much new thinking is required to grapple with the new global stakes of the world that are suddenly thrust upon Americans, many of who are unlike Eleanor Roosevelt or Wilkie, and have been content to just sort of stand aside and let the world go on as it is, or imagine that the United States can simply either hold itself apart from the world, or kind of be this sort of great player in the world that doesn't need to take into account the ideas of the people of the world.
We have a question that again relates to both figures, and also to one of my a comment by one of my classes that was visited that Blanche visited, and the student said, that Eleanor Roosevelt was like the Oprah of her time because of the way she used media. So there was a question in the chat box about the way they used media. Reporters, it brings in another part of the chat question. So can you all speak about that a bit?
Sure, I could talk about that first question there about reporters accompanying Wilkie. He was a huge media sort of phenomenon. As I suggested in my talk about thinking about this as the age of broadcasting, he really was able to drive big stories for a while there. Reporters loved Wilkie. He was always great in front of a microphone, great with reporters, great with quotes. He had this sort of way with relating to regular people. He could make sort of policy ideas and political ideas really clear through sort of offhand remarks and wisecracks and other kinds of sort of shorthand that headline writers and reporters loved. So he was officially accompanied on this trip by two people who were actually journalists, but who were employed at this time by the US government for the Office of War Information. This was Joseph Barnes and Gardner Cowles. And Joseph Barnes had been a New York Herald Tribune reporter, had been a Moscow reporter for many years, would later come under suspicion in the Red Scare, unfortunately, for the time that he lived in the Soviet Union. But he was a kind of another internationalist, part of a whole generation of reporters who thought hard about the role of the United States in the world in the interwar period. There've been several books recently about this that are quite worth reading, about the journalists who did that work, and many of whom influenced Wilkie. And then Gardner Cowles was a newspaper publisher. He was a Republican sort of bigwig who published Look magazine and the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And so they both accompanied him. So for them, they were there to get the word out, and reporters flocked to the newsreel cameras. Reporters were flocked to the tarmacs wherever Wilkie's plane, the Gulliver, alighted across the world. And it was huge coverage of everything. And particularly, as I suggested, upon his return, his speech, which 36 million people listened to, which was the kind of audience that people like Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR got over all the networks when they gave a big speech. So he was very much a media phenomenon, and that's what I talk about, right? And I think this is in some ways a little bit different than Roosevelt, right? Who was also a media phenomenon. But Roosevelt, and Blanche can talk more about this, was, as she already has, was connected to movements, right? To actual political movements. In a way, Wilkie was not. He was a kind of free agent, floating about, trying to shift and pull the levers of public opinion from in this sort of age of broadcasting figure. And that suggests both the power he had, but also some of the kind of weaknesses or short-lived nature of some of his ideas along with his early death.
Just to say, because Eleanor Roosevelt really believed that we need movements to make change. So it was really important that she had a syndicated column. I mean, she wrote her My Day column from 1936 to the end of her life every single day. And it was published all across the country in about 300 newspapers. Then she had a radio show. She was, there's a book about Eleanor Roosevelt being the first lady of radio, a weekly radio show. Then she, both as First Lady and subsequently as a delegate to the United Nations, she had press conferences. At first, her press conferences were for women journalists only, which became very, very popular and important. But then she had press conferences that included the press all over. So she really is, I mean, even beyond Oprah in her outreach. In the 50s, she also had a television program. I mean, it's really amazing. And in addition to her daily column, she wrote dozens and dozens, countless, really, journal articles, plus numbers of books. So, you know, she really was reaching out. The goal was, you know, to educate, inform, and galvanize movements. And she did have this global vision. I always go around quoting Wendell Willkie, and I think Wendell Willkie said, and maybe I made it up or read it somewhere, but I didn't see it in your book. He said, everything that happens anywhere affects everybody everywhere. We are all connected,
Yeah.
one world.
Right.
And that vision was also a vision that Eleanor Roosevelt shared. Everything that happens affects everybody everywhere, and we are all connected. And in one of her, I think the most important for this moment of her books is called The Moral Basis of Democracy, which is a collection of essays she wrote during the 30s, finally published in 1940. She says the 130 million people who make up our great nation come from every nation on the globe: Asians, Africans, Europeans, Latin Americans. We are truly the melting pot of the world. Now we face an entire continent of vast resources, and many people are debased by poverty or the accident of race, and therefore have no stake in our democracy. And it is often said that we are free, and then sneeringly, free to starve. Well, that is not an amusement. Nobody can say Indians or Negroes of this country are free. Racial prejudice enslaves, poverty enslaves. Other religious groups labor under other discrimination, and we have to end that. And when we end that, we will begin the journey to a wholesome, free, and just one world. And that's her vision. Moral Basis of Democracy, I must say, 2 years before Willkie's tour.
Yeah.
So I've put a link to the book in the chat, and I highly recommend reading it. And I know my students have enjoyed reading it and gotten a lot out of it. I want to hand the floor to Laura, who's got her hand up. Another co-founder of GlowBio.
I do think maybe we're skipping over Tom's question though in the chat. I'm not sure.
Why don't you go ahead and ask that and yours?
Okay, all right. Tom, I'm going to read your question now. Professor Wiesen-Cook, thanks for your fascinating talk. Did Eleanor Roosevelt get into trouble for later, or did she have to later recant her statements about private property as the root cause of war?
She got into trouble. John Edgar Hoover had a huge file on Eleanor Roosevelt. In fact, one of the things I'm currently working on is Hoover's war against Eleanor Roosevelt. And the very first entry into her FBI file is when she supports the World Court, 1924, publicly. But the FBI file, the House Un-American Activities Committee, she's called a traitor. She's called a communist, which is really bizarre given how anti-communist Eleanor Roosevelt actually was. But she is called all of those things. Nevertheless, your silence will not protect you, as Audre Lorde always said, and she refused to be silent or recant any of the truths that she spoke, no matter how she was attacked.
All right, thank you. So then I will jump in now with my tsunami of questions. So I can't type and think at the same time, so I will just communicate this orally. First of all, thanks. This is really thought-provoking also because of the time period, the register of ideas that is great interest to me as well. So I've tried to think of a way to tie together all of these loose thoughts that I scribbled down into some sort of nice coherent question. I don't think that's going to work out. So I'll just highlight a few things that struck me and that translate into questions. And I think most of them are probably for Sandy, although I could very much imagine that Blanche also has a thing or two to say about them. And first of all, the question of counterfactuality, which I think is something that you Sandy, you allude to, you know, the what if scenarios. What if Wilkie had been elected? What if he hadn't died, etc. I think this is very often, this way of thinking is very often connected to Wilkie, and I just wonder if we can push that further. How do you feel about counterfactuality and these kind of what if scenarios, if we would further develop them as historians and especially as biographers? Do you think that's all right? And how far can we stretch that? And what can it gain us? So it's really more of a methodological question coming from someone who's very much interested in the counterfactual approach. So I study, or I have studied, a particular Jewish political movement, the Jewish territorialist movement, that existed as an alternative to the Zionist movement for decades. And was never successful. So this is kind of the failed alternative, which, because of its failure, its ultimate failure, and the type of success of the Zionist movement, eventually the territorialists were relegated to a footnote in history. So my starting point is very much challenging that failure as the starting point, which sometimes flows over into the what if, like what if they had been successful? In the minds of the contemporaries, that was a possibility. So maybe in the minds of the contemporaries of Wilkie, before he's not elected, before he dies, there are these possible scenarios. And what does that tell us about that particular zeitgeist? So I'm just curious if you think this is a viable way of thinking about a biographical approach to Wilkie's life. And then tendentiously connected to that, the one world concept, which is the title of his very famous book, which is a concept that I think, at least I have come across again in the context of the Jewish territorialists in the 1940s, especially into the 1950s, where this idea of one world is really picked up by these Russian socialist revolutionary Jews who had this movement at that point. But it seems to me that there's something lost in translation there. So Wilkie had a certain purpose. There is the title for this book, but the concept starts living its own life. So I'm just curious if you think that's true, if there's something lost the moment a title with such resonance is projected into the world. The obvious parallel in my mind, at least, and Blanche actually mentioned, is The Melting Pot, which is actually the title of a 1908 play by the Anglo-Jewish playwright Israel Zangwill, who happens to be actually the leader of the territorialist movement. So we come full circle here. But in any case, he writes this play to describe what he sees as a process very much focused on Jewish immigrants to the United States in the very early years of the 20th century, and is not necessarily a positive development. So he has a certain idea what the melting pot is, but then that concept gains a lot of resonance and it starts living its own life. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that then becomes something else. But what do we do when we try to trace this intellectual history of a concept, especially when it's a book title? And so I'm just curious what you see in that translation process of the one world thing. So I know I've been talking now for a long time. Just one more thing. Wilkie was a Republican. In a way, what is described here might strike us as a liberal project. But my question is it really a liberal project at the end of the day, like purely? Because at the same time, you also suggest that there is a certain saviorism in here, the United States saving the world, power dynamics. So is there a tension between that kind of liberal idea about the one world and the way maybe in Wilkie's mind it actually serves to transform American power in this moment where Blanche says everything is up in the air, where there's this moment of unclear directions. So yeah, in short, is this really a liberal project, or should we label it differently? Thank you.
Sure. Let me start with the last one. I think that it's actually quite important to see it as a liberal project. And by that, I mean liberal as in the liberalism that was coming to define political movements in the early to mid 20th century in the United States. And that means a liberalism that has tried to shape itself as in opposition to an earlier moment of what we might think of as classical liberalism, right? Where freedom is based entirely in the market, right? This is a liberalism that is more shaped by the progressive era, right? Where it imagines that what we'll need is some kind of state intervention to shape the national economies and to shape everyday lives and to shape, in this case, the world, right? To create internationalism as a form of progressivism. And that is, I think, very much what the liberal project was in those years, both with its kind of hopeful side and with some of its darker side, right? With the sense that it was a kind of controlling project, right? It wasn't, for Wilkie, a kind of socialist idea, right, of full equality. It was, in some sense, more of a top-down kind of project. So I see it as liberalism in the way that we might, in a critical way, see it now as both a project of a certain kind of freedom, but a freedom that is at the same time somewhat directed from, to some extent, from above, while also voicing itself in an imagination of equality and of freedom and of democracy. It hopes for those things, but it's enmeshed in a larger set of historical processes. And so I think that's really important to understand that. I think that ties into the situation with the concept of one world, which is, as I suggested, has several valences and succeeds and travels in the way that you suggest it does, Laura, because it is such a kind of amorphous idea, a baggy idea, an idea that people can latch onto from various different kinds of traditions, right? There is a liberal tradition there. There is a kind of socialist tradition there, very much, right? Of universalism. And then there's also the way that it is, again, a kind of world-shaping vision that will require power to do so. And power will always require some kind of, some forms of coercion at some level. So one world is part of that idea. It lives on, I think. I prefer to see this as a kind of cultural history of an idea because it moves in all these kind of different versions of, it moves in all these different places across all kinds of different mediums. And that means how sort of flexible it is, but also that it tends to kind of maybe be not as rigorous as one might like, but that's also its strength, all right, as Blanche has shown, right? It really moves people in movements and in everyday life to think about what it is how they're connected and related to one another across the world. Can I just say one thing about counterfactuality, and then I'll turn it over to you, Blanche. The counterfactual for me is a sort of, I kind of tried to keep my arm's length at that, while also to some extent entertaining the sense that we might want to know what would happen if we thought harder about the ideas that Wilkie had put out on the page. So not as much about what would have happened had he lived, but what would have happened if and how can we continue to think through the dilemmas that his actions and his ideas put forward for us. So that's how I tend to think of counterfactuals, as a kind of a challenge that lives on. And the conclusion of my book traces how, and this brings us back to the question of one world, traces how the idea of one world lives on in different places, different movements, different ideas, from environmentalism to anti-colonialism to globalization, right? And how its ideas change here and there, but how its dilemma continues to be brought up in new moments and new times, just as it stands for us today. So I tend not to sort of pose strict counterfactuals, but to try to think about the cultural history of possibilities and dilemmas, and how history brings them back up for us in that kind of rhyming way that history works.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Sandy. I always say to my students, ifs in history are big stiffs. And I don't go into the counterfactual for what would happen if he had lived, or let's imagine that. But when you talk about the territorialist, that's an idea. And what does that idea still live? So one can pursue it. It's not a question of a counterfactual. It's where does it go? Where does it live? How does it hang out? What of the future of territory, And I think this whole issue that we're talking about, one world, is so important now as we look at, you know, the planet we're upon, where we are so threatened by global disaster, climate disaster, natural disasters, and then the march of authoritarianism, and, you know, the one world or none, given the use of military and the threats of nuclear disaster. So Eleanor Roosevelt was very clear. Her radical definition of democracy was service for all. Imagine that, service for all. And her definition of neighbor was global. We are many. We are everywhere. We are all. And that's, you know, that's our heritage. Where do we go from here, and how do we build the movements for peace and justice and human rights for all that will, in fact, save us?
I know I want to ask one more question, which builds on Laura's question and your responses, and whether I put it in the form of a counterfactual. If they were alive, what advice would they be giving us today? Or what are the ideas that we really need to take from these two one-worlders and put into action right now?
Well, I think the US has never ratified, never even discussed the covenant of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for economic and social rights. Imagine that. So there's nesri.org, NESRI, that's working to do that, but we've never even had a conversation about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, you know, I mean, it did pass the United Nations on the 10th of December, 1948. And there are two covenants, thanks to Zubin Mehta, who said, well, if you're not going to get it passed, divide it. Jimmy Carter signed both covenants. George Herbert Walker Bush got the political and civil covenant ratified in 1991, but we've never even had a conversation. So there it is. Do we believe in human rights or don't we? Can we really make it a US reality and a world reality? And then if it becomes a world reality, what is the role? We need to, you know, reinvigorate the United Nations, so that the United Nations is really this community of discussion and peace, which is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. I mean, I think that's the one, you know, if there was anything that Wilkie was criticized for, was that his lack of very concrete, specific ideas. It was unlike Eleanor Roosevelt in that Eleanor Roosevelt had many concrete, specific ideas. Wilkie was about building public opinion for a sort of larger idea, thus again, the capacious nature of one world. But his one specific idea that he did pursue, or well, several, there were a number of them, but this one is the one that I think we would want to return to, is to think about how the global moment that we're living in now has kind of once again thrown things up in the air and made new things possible, right? With the pressure of Russia's invasion upon Ukraine right now, is putting all kinds of new strategic possibilities out there in the world. And I think that's one of the things that Wilkie really pressed upon people during the war, during his sort of one world moment. One was to say, look, we need to figure out how to cooperate with people we might think of as our enemies, right? And so, and really his strategic vision was to cooperate with the Soviet Union so that the world could usher the decolonizing nations onto the world stage in an equitable and democratic way and make a real democratic world government, right, of some sort. And he hoped that the United Nations would be that. That was his strategic vision. And sometimes the one world idea gets kind of denigrated as the sort of just sort of some touchy-feely idea about global unity. And that it is in some sense a vision of that, but it's for Wilkie, it was through a kind of very strategic path, fraught one, of course, given the nature of the Soviet Union at that time, but one that didn't seem impossible given his conversations with Stalin. And I go into many of the details of this in the book. Putting that aside, right, the other thing that he said was, to do this, we need a more democratic structure, just as Blanche was suggesting, for the United Nations, one not dominated by the Security Council. And I wonder if now we are in a moment where the United States, if we could be convinced to climb down off our high horse a little bit, could work with the Chinese, and they could be convinced to climb down off the high horse they are hoping to ascend, or ascending already in these years, given what Russia has just done, to perhaps rethink the shape of the United Nations, to more closely emulate the kind of cooperation we've seen in the last, 8 days between Europe and the United States, and just a little bit China, right, to contain a threat like Putin has shown the world is always going to throw up. How do we figure out to make this new body do the work it was supposed to do when the charter was first proclaimed in 1944 and 45? And so Wilkie's idea to make a more representative world body where every nation has a say would be, I think, something that there will be hopefully a lot of energy put into over the next generation, given everything that we face.
That is a phenomenal place to rest. What an upbeat and hopeful note.
Doing the best we can, and given the
Yeah,
circumstances.
really great.
Yeah.
Really, really great.
Thank you both so much. This has been a fabulous conversation. We look forward to more, and we cannot thank you enough for your time and energy.
Thank you
Thank
all
you.
for coming.
Thank you so much. Really great.